Welcome to this episode of People Unfiltered, powered by Ideas Global. This is the podcast where we explore issues that are affecting our society, our workplaces, and our lives. This podcast is tailored to support leaders that are working on inclusion, diversity, equity, activism, and social impact. Let me share with you a bit about Ideas Global. We are a membership platform where we provide carefully vetted networks and essential insights that empower our members to create significant impact in today's dynamic business landscape. Our members join a powerful network of peers to drive innovative ideas, forward-looking perspectives, and to share proven best practices to address critical leadership challenges. In today's episode, I'm very pleased to have a conversation with the managing principal of Raven, Christina McHenry. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very excited to have an opportunity to hear about the recent report on winning the messaging on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. I think our audience would really appreciate getting a chance to get to know you a little bit better, learning a bit about your background and why you chose this field.
Now, great. Well, I will hope not to go on too long, but my background actually is in journalism. I started out in broadcast journalism. I was a producer at CBS Evening News, ABC News Nightline, PBS's NewsHour. I produced Gwen Eifel's Washington Week when she went over there for a number of years. And so, that's sort of my founding work. And I really loved, sort of helping to choose what stories were told to viewers and what pieces were included. And I think I enjoyed the pace and sort of the, sort of vibrancy of it. But then I went in-house to Fannie Mae and then to another organization that had a community development focus. And in both of those spaces, what I really enjoyed was like the ability to be for something. So in journalism, you're really sort of up on the balcony, sort of pulling things apart a little bit, which I think is a really important work to do. And it's sort of under siege right now. But what I enjoy about the work that I've shifted into is that I really get to advocate for things that I care about and people in places that are in need of an extra voice.
Fantastic. Can you tell me a little bit about where you grew up?
Well, I'm from Washington, D.C., which is where I'm sitting right now, actually in Maryland. And but I sort of the East Coast is probably my home base. My mom taught at Mount Holyoke College, which is in Western Mass. And my father was at the UN, so I was in New York City for high school and post-college, and I went to school outside of Boston. So this whole strip between DC and Boston is my space.
So help me understand why Raven chose to do some research on winning the messaging on diversity, equity, and inclusion.
This space has been space that Raven has been committed to since its founding. And the firm is about 21, 22 years old. I've been with the firm for about 8. But this is, sort of at its core, the work that we do and work that we have led on over a period of time. And over the last several years in particular, as we've seen some of the backlash driven largely by the far right, we have been thinking about how do we come at this work in ways that are more inclusive and not just of, sort of the base, but also how do we grow the people who are interested in thinking about this, talking about it, shifting their position, adding their voice to the work. And so we really wanted to understand better what was working and what wasn't. And again, we want to, always pay attention to capture, recapture, activate, excite the base and have them understand what's at stake here. But then also importantly, we want to know about the center right. Where are there areas of common ground, common goals, common values. And so that was some of the work that we really set out to do in the research. So you'll see that we chose 2 pollsters, one left of center, one right of center, to engage in that work because we wanted to have both perspectives, not just doing the work, but also at the table as we built the work. I imagine that a lot goes into even creating a survey tool, right? It's like there can be bias in either intentionally or unintentionally in the way the questions are asked, who they're asked of, et cetera. And so we really wanted to think about at a very basic level, what did we want to learn and from whom and how to get there?
And what was some of the things that went into this, the methodology for the research? I think the audience would really like to understand how you actually conducted it.
So, and I'll try and be very facile on this. One, we first met with a bunch of allied organizations that we work with, including Stacey Abrams' American Pride Rising, Color of Change, and some others, to talk a little bit about what were they seeing, what were they hearing, what gave them pause over the conversation and the way that the environment has changed and work around diversity, equity, inclusion has been twisted. And so we wanted to understand those things. And then we sat down, both our team at Raven, but also obviously with the survey leaders, and talked a little bit about how do we get at better understanding where we are, what's at stake, what's working, both what's working from our perspective, but also what are the, sort of attacks that people hear and that can have gained some traction in the environment. So we had those conversations, and then we thought about like sort of where did we want to do something really extensive. And I'm proud to say I think this was a really extensive undertaking in that we did 13 focus groups that were white college and then separately non-college, et cetera. So we were able to look at both white community, Black community, Hispanic, et cetera, and to really look, in some cases, we were able to look at age, particularly in the Black and Latino communities. Did some more sort of Gen Z type conversations, as well as sort of professional and sort of older or mid-career folks. But we wanted to make sure that we had a wealth of voices that we were hearing at the focus group level. We also did something that I thought was really cool, and I've done a lot of surveys, but I hadn't done this before, which was a journaling component, which allowed folks to really talk about how they were feeling and thinking about this issue, but privately. It's hard to get into a room and then find that, oh, am I the only person who thinks X, or I don't want to say the wrong thing, or I don't want to use the wrong language, et cetera, right? And so what we did was we put questions to folks that they would really just put in their quote unquote journals. And that way we were able to hear from them, in a way, more freely than they might have felt they could speak in a group. So that was
And
another piece and allowed us to get some like sort of real insight. And then finally we did what I think was a pretty large, if not the largest, public opinion survey of more than 3,000 folks to really sort of do what is more like a typical poll, right? And so, but it was a very large sampling. We oversampled in the Asian American Pacific Islander population, but it really gave us like sort of a really broad swath of folks to hear from, and I think that enriched our findings. And then finally, we tested some language, some messaging in qual boards at the end. So it was a pretty robust. I mean, I would say, of the surveys I've done, it was the most robust I've ever done at one time. We look forward to growing and expanding that further as we go along. But really, as a baseline, I think it had a lot of, sort of bits and pieces for everyone. There's things we wish we did more of, and things we wish we sort of could have probed more deeply on, et cetera. And then areas that we weren't able to go into at all that, we've identified that we'd be curious about. But at its core, I think this is really sort of landmark work that we look forward to updating. Of course, the election, has happened, and there've been, sort of the events of the time that's passed since the survey. But I think we learned a lot of great stuff, and I think what we've heard back from folks that we shared it with is that it was helpful.
how did you find the willingness of people to want to participate in this? Was there any misgivings or fear given the current climate?
The survey went into the field like June through August of last year.
Mm.
So, there were rumblings of the climate to come, but not, sort of the sort of full scale that we're engaged in now, particularly, with the change in administrations. And so it is the pollster's domain to find the folks and, sort of either convince them or talk them into it or whatever. So that part I'm not expert on, but I will say that I think I sat in on most of the focus groups, and I found folks, at least it felt to me, that they were very comfortable in the conversation. They were very sort of earnest in their thinking about the topic. They had, if they had hesitation, it was not I don't know how to say this. I think they were, sort of fully engaged. So there was no one sort of sitting back and not, sort of joining the conversation. And that I think, sort of speaks to what the pollster is after too, right? You can't have a room with only like one person talking or someone taking over the whole thing. But I think it was a really robust series of conversations that we took part in. And that is the kind of, sort of value that I think we're able to add.
Yeah, well, incredibly robust, huge diversity, largest of its kind. Amazing that you actually had an opportunity to put this together. I'm really curious, what are the major findings? What did you actually pull out from this that's going to be useful to our listeners as they're thinking about rebranding DEI, dealing with the current climate, and the questions that they're getting from their employees and colleagues?
Yep. No, absolutely. Well, so this is the fun part. We created a message guide, or messaging guide that we have shared with folks, and we're happy to share with you. But I'm going to talk through that. I mean, there is also a larger sort of deck that has a lot more of the intricacies and that kind of thing, and I can also share that with you as well. But why don't I just start with, sort of one of our first and sort of primary core insights was to use the whole phrase diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to stop using DEI. The abbreviation itself has been, sort of hijacked by the far right and demonized. The words themselves are meaningful to most people, which is what we found in the survey. Acronyms, sort of on their face are intended to be for people who are in the know, and they exclude people who aren't, right? And so that is very off-brand for what diversity, equity, inclusion is all about. So to use an acronym that some people know and some people don't know is off-putting, sort of on its face. So how do we talk about this work and talk about its values in ways that are meaningful to folks? So we found that most people understood the term diversity, equity, a little less so. Inclusion, also another word that people really sort of rallied around and well understood. So, and it takes some effort to really say diversity, equity, inclusion, and not, sort of go to the easy path, which is DEI, and find ourselves maybe unintentionally saying something that we don't intend to, or playing into the hands of opponents, but also let the words reinforce the work and the faith and the values that we have. So
That's incredibly powerful because it was a little shocking for me that DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wouldn't have thought that people would have made that discernment, that difference.
yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting thing, and we saw it, sort of with ESG also.
Oh,
And so we've seen like sort of the sort of playbook of the right is to take a concept that people don't really understand and sort of, label it and then sort of demonize it, et cetera. And, what we hope to do in this first instance is bring us back to reminding ourselves and those we're talking to what it is we are talking about. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are core fundamental American values. And that we think that people, sort of can rally around. So that was one of the sort of key findings. Another was, sort of thinking about, emphasizing respect, belonging, individual potential. Those are the things that resonate across party lines and racial groups. Those are the unifying messages. And we really have to counter this sort of notion of a quota narrative directly. Diversity, equity, and inclusion opens doors for opportunity and support rather than sort of dictating our hiring decisions. So that message is particularly effective with older and college educated Americans. It's one I think that comes into play a lot in the workplace. But really just thinking about that diversity, equity, and inclusion does not support or create or condone quotas. It really is about creating opportunity to open doors for everyone. One of the other sort of surprising things is sort of what for us was hearing that we should be avoiding social justice messaging, right? The notion that diversity, equity, inclusion efforts and programs exist just to ensure that we're correcting past and even existing injustices and unfair practices is a polarizing message. And so, what may play well with one population plays less well with another. And so when you're thinking about how do you have a conversation with a, sort of a large group of people, it really is thinking about emphasizing respect, belonging, individual potential, et cetera, and not, sort of the social justice piece that maybe, was more effective in the past.
Well, similar to what you said, respect, belonging, individual potential, those are tenets of the foundation of the US country, right? There's these idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that individuality, and being able to have anyone be president. That is sort of the fundamentals that this country has been forged on.
Exactly. And exactly. And so, and I think, we have thought and talked a bit about, sort of that the notion of patriotism. Patriotism isn't like sort of owned and unique to the right. We, think of people who believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we need to claim patriotism as our own, that this is a space that is important to us. It is a commitment we have to the nation, to our founding principles, to our aspirations, like in the truest sense. Who do we want to be? And when we think about some of the sort of founding, even if imperfect, elements of the nation, when we think about our greatest aspirations, this has to be one. And so, sort of thinking about how we remind folks of those aspirations and sort of together work towards reaching them, that's an important part of this work. So, and other findings that we had, one was this idea of sort of calling out opponents of diversity, equity, inclusion for using government overreach, sort of attempting to police private entities, to tell companies, organizations, schools, et cetera, what they can and can't do. And calling this overreach is a message that works especially well with more conservative voters who may oppose a lot of government intervention. And so it'll be interesting to see over the next however long, if we're watching this administration as it calls out both, sort of makes changes to the federal government and its directives and staffing, but also as it, sort of reaches across into private industry, to see whether or not people are enthusiastic about that, whether they see that as an appropriate step or whether they see that as overreach, and whether there's opportunity for us to sort of push back against this notion based on that finding. And then finally, one of the others was, sort of taking advantage of what we found was sort of a distaste for and a wish for relief on our polarization, right? And so we're thinking about how do we frame diversity, equity, inclusion as opponents of that work as dividers, right? Who are trying to, sort of pull us apart, create trouble where there isn't trouble, and sort of use that to align with the public's fatigue with division and polarization. So thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is what seeks to help us define common threads, commonality, an opportunity for us to come together. And efforts against diversity, equity, and inclusion are the things that are really, sort of the efforts to pull us apart.
And so these findings, were they consistent regardless of what political party somebody was affiliated with?
We see some, sort of fluctuations, and I wish I was better to delve into them, each one on the fly. But in general, what I've just offered you is sort of an overview of the, sort of most effective pieces of it. Reaching the right, in terms of like that government overreach piece, that is definitely something that more conservative audiences are, sort of maybe swayed by because they are already sort of hardwired to be opposed to a lot of government interaction or engagement. Thinking about avoiding social justice messaging, again, that is the center right component. And it has to do with sort of how do we broaden the conversation and sort of look towards the future. And then, sort of thinking about emphasizing respect, belonging, individual potential, that's something that resonates across party lines, racial groups, et cetera. That is like one of the very rare, completely unifying messages.
Very interesting. And I'm wondering if there were any surprises for you. Was there anything in there that you didn't expect to find?
So interestingly, we did some work around messengers and, sort of who were the best folks to help to carry forth this conversation who was best heard. And I guess what the thing that surprised me out of that was that celebrity voices were not as effective as I thought they would be. And interestingly, I even in seeing those results late summer, I sort of discounted them and sort of, sort of in my own work and thinking, wanted to sort of continue along that path. And then I think that our findings, for better or worse, have been sort of reinforced, sort of through the outcome of the election, and, sort of whether or not those voices, sort of particularly celebrity voices on the left were effective in bringing folks either out to vote or around to, progressive ways of thinking. So that was sort of interesting piece. We didn't delve like hugely deeply. It was sort of, something that we sort of started in on. If we could do more, we might go a little deeper in that space. But I was surprised to see that because I think we see celebrities, many of them are able to, sort of seem like they transcend race in that they, their voice can carry into sort of different populations at different times. You see these big, whether it's big concert tours or different athletes or et cetera. And so on, I think of their achievement as offering them a unique voice and position. And I think what we found is not necessarily. So that was a surprising piece.
And that's in particular weighing in on the ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Doesn't necessarily translate that that's the same thing around whether they are championing a particular candidate, or does it?
No, not necessarily, but it just, it lays question to, big picture, yes, how effective are they? But specifically, narrowly to this conversation, we found that the voices that were best heard were those who were able to speak from a place of deep and longstanding commitment to the values, right? And they didn't have any sort of profit, corporate motives, et cetera, that they, sort of were sort of already having a track record of commitment, and be seen as accomplished in this space or in their fields around this. And so it didn't mean that, it doesn't mean that a politician or celebrity, or a politician or a business leader can't meet that threshold of credibility. But there also is that sort of risk of being both polarizing or drawing skepticism from voters who sort of question their intentions, whether it's a perception that politicians prioritize power or business leaders prioritize profit, and sort of that notion of sort of caring about appearances and sort of how they show up, et cetera. So as I say, the credible messenger piece was an interesting aside for us in that it gave us a few clues, but not the fullest picture that I think we should want to better understand over time.
So the data is fantastic. It's wonderful to be able to give this to our listeners as they're thinking about either their rebranding or the way that they're moving forward with DEI. But we're seeing so many companies moving away from their DEI commitments. To your point about government overreach, they're reacting kind of proactively before there's been any real requirement of them to do so. They're moving away from their DEI commitments. Now, Raven as a company, as an entity, has core values of championing diversity, equity, and justice, which I really found uplifting when I was going through all of your material. It'd be really important to understand how are you reacting to navigating the the political climate that we're under?
It's a great question. I think it is one that, first of all of us, we are all, sort of human beings, and we care deeply about the work. And so I will say that my certainty is that each of us face this moment in different ways, whether it's sadness or anger or sort of wanting to fight back or wanting to hide. But my guess is that it's a little bit of all of these things over a period of time. But as an organization, I think we are steadfast in that that we are no different than we were. I think that our experience in this space, not just our commitment, but our experience in working with organizations that are trying to navigate and have been trying to navigate, how do they best participate in efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion? Those are honest questions. They have been over a long period of time. Everyone approaches them or enters them from where they are, right? There's no, I mean, that's the beauty and the pain of this whole conversation is it's not like there's one like level threshold where we all sit. Everyone approaches it differently based on their background, based on their experience, based on who they know, how they've lived, who they work with, who they worship with, what their aspirations are, both as individuals and, for our communities. So there's so many pieces to this puzzle, and that makes it, I think, sort of exciting, challenging, but also it means there's so much possibility. We have the opportunity to bring something that is a new combination of bits and pieces, always. And as we do that, and as we learn from each other, and as we create space for each other to engage in this conversation, there's no end to what we can achieve. And so I think that we think about applying our experience and our heart to how to help organizations move through this moment. And some organizations want to lean in and be loud and talk about what they do and what they believe and, sort of have a great tolerance for risk. Others have less tolerance for risk legitimately, and this is not mine to cast any value or criticism. It may be that from some organizations, in order to serve the populations they do, to do the work they do, they just cannot be targeted and they cannot risk their funding or position or what have you. And so I don't judge how people have to approach this conversation. What I hope that they do is continue at it in the way that they can. And to the extent that I or we can help them to do that. And I don't just mean Raven, I mean all of us, this community of people who care about this issue. Like, how do we help people get through both this time, but also to further enrich us by their presence? And so that's where, I feel like I lean into the work. It's not because there's only one path, and I don't believe in only one path, and I don't have only one path for my own life and dreams, right? But I want to help folks to see there are possibilities even when it seems that there are not. And so we work with folks who are getting ready to be called before Congress. We work with folks who have lost funding. We work with folks who fear risking their funding. We work with folks who are trying to navigate very challenging internal situations. I imagine many of these listeners as well. And sort of how do you have what we're calling sort of that next conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion? It's not just what to call it, but it's how do we engage in a way maybe that's different than we did, which is not to say that that was bad and this is good, but to say this is an evolutionary process. And so what we've done in the past, what did we do well? Let's bring that forward. What can we do better? Let's work on that too, right? How do we bring people who wasn't in the conversation who needs to be now? And I guarantee you there are definitely folks because that is how this goes, right? You always identify something a little different or something you missed, or maybe that's something you either overdid or underdid. And how do we move forward in that space? That I think is where we have possibility.
Oh, no, I think your discussion of the possibilities inspires me and gets me uplifted. But I am reminded of how I felt, week one of the administration, that weekend after I've been getting bombarded by all of this information of the changes that were coming. And I actually personally, I thought I was getting sick. Like I thought I was getting a head cold, right? Just because I was feeling so down. And it's one of the reasons why we really want to have Ideas Global as a platform for people to come together and support each other in these times. I'm wondering, for you as a Black woman, how has the backlash to DEI impacted you personally?
It tears at my soul.
Yeah.
I think of, and I won't say that it's my life's work because, it's a piece of my life's work. There are those who have done so much more than I have done, who have committed so much more, and who think about this, sort of all day, every day, and have for many, many years. For me, it's a piece of my work that I care deeply about. And I think I try and infuse my other work with the learnings and the values of this and take it into other spaces, but it's not always explicit, right? Sometimes it is something that I bring quietly. As a Black woman, I'm sort of like, on the one hand, how much more? And on the other hand, I'm like, bring it on, right? Because we are both or I'll say for myself, I am saddened and frustrated and afraid for where we are. And yet we've been in bad places before. And I think that we have in us strength that will carry us forward, that will draw those together who, sort of feed our spirits, and soothe us and strengthen us so that we can go forward in whatever way we can contribute to this conversation and fight.
I would really love to know, since you're having all of these conversations with your clients, what the atmosphere is like right now in the DC area on this topic. And are there any conversations going on? Like, can you share with us a little bit of sort of the juicy insights?
I don't know if I have any juicy insights, but I will say, I mean, I think there's a lot of discomfort in terms of, sort of fear about whether it's jobs, funding, et cetera. I think there's a lot of dismay, like, oh, this is worse than I thought it would be, or oh, that's exactly what they said, and here we sit. It is, I mean, every moment is something new, and I think that's part of the intent, right? Is for us to be sort of unsettled by the pace and the extreme of the actions. And it is unsettling, and it does feel extreme. And yet, like any other, I'll just say bit of warfare, we break it into pieces and we just work those pieces. And that is what we do. And that's why I say we come at it from a variety of different places, and we have to bring, the experience, what I say, the care and caring, right, to this effort. And for everyone, it will be a little bit different. And every day is a little bit different. So, I mean, I think that in a weird way, I mean, sort of my training as a journalist, I enjoy the urgency of the moment. That is something I know what to do with, even if I am heartbroken over the content.
No, I can completely relate to that. I think it'd be really important for our audience to hear how you would like to see companies act with the findings. What would you like to see people do with the work that you've done?
So there are a couple pieces. I mean, one is, in reality, no laws have changed, which is to say it is still illegal to discriminate based on race or any of the other protected areas. And so that's an important piece. I mean, I think, folks are making shifts and changes that they feel they need to make out of concern, risk aversion, what they think they're hearing, et cetera. And I think, sort of one important bit of work that we're trying to do is to engage with general counsels so that they better understand what is in the law, and talking with, sort of former EEOC folks and that kind of thing, to have that conversation, to really understand what it is that we can and cannot do and say in this moment.
Yes.
And then if, for those who choose for political reasons, semantics, whatever is their reason that they want to pull back, at least they know what and why they're pulling back, right? Is it because of something legal? Is it because of how they want to show up or not? What is the reason for the shift and change? And then in terms of like chief diversity officers, the conversations that we look forward to having both with them, and we hope that they have with their teams, their employees, colleagues, is what should this next generation, this next conversation look like? What worked? What didn't? What can we do better? What is true to our culture of our organization? What do we aspire to? Like, how do we get there? How do we have this not be dictated through like trainings and that kind of thing, but how do we really bring more people to the conversation, right? And we're in a better place than we've been before for more people to join the conversation, because there's been sort of more training, more education, more familiarity around these issues. So now let's take advantage of what we've done and see where does it take us, and how do we have more people on board, right? So we're not like dragging folks along, which is not to imply that we were once, but just to say that we have the opportunity to come together and move together more as one. And sort of how do we think about that? So that's a piece of it. And then, I mean, really, sort of leaning into, as I said, like sort of using the word, if you're talking about DEI, really talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. Use the words. Think about the values, inclusion and belonging, and that space. It may be that you don't call it what you used to call it, but you still can show up in that space. And so that, and as I say, for every organization, the answer may be a little bit different. And we may get to a moment where we have an answer that we want everyone to do. But in truth, that's not brand centric to this work, right? This work is not that there's one answer. It is like, let's find a path forward that works for you, that is towards our goal and our shared values. And it's not to step away from the values, but the path, we have to find the paths that work today. And for some, it will be to march boldly forward. And for some, it will be to find a quieter way to achieve those same goals.
Wonderful. Now, so what's next? Are there other research opportunities that are coming up?
So we've identified some areas that we'd like to probe more deeply, and we'll look for funding to do that. And so my hope is that we're going to come up on the anniversary of the work that we did, and that at least around that time we'll be able to start over. We have the anniversary of the 5th anniversary of George Floyd's murder coming up. Curious to see how that will play in the air. The administration obviously is going full bore along its work, and it may reach a point where it oversteps to, in ways that cause its own, reaction. And so, sort of like we are watching for those moments and really trying to like sort of present into the ether some different visions of what this fight looks like and what the conversations might look like. We're working on some produced content so that, that we'll have something, ways to bring to life some of the findings that we've had around how to think and talk about the work, what's effective and what's not. One of the things we didn't talk much about, but that safety angle is a very potent one that opponents use, right? The notion that, and it's absurd on its face, and yet it's not just, sort of the far right that is concerned about whether or not the people, our doctors, the people flying our planes, et cetera, are the best. And so, we have to, and that's why we have to push back against this notion of like quotas, and that it somehow is like putting people who are unqualified in positions. We have to remind folks that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not about quotas, and nor is it about pushing forward people who are unqualified. It is actually at its opposite, which is to say, it is to take the most qualified and make sure that we are finding them. And that is, sort of a piece of that work. And so, hopefully what comes next is building a really solid series of ways to combat some of the misinformation that is out there on the topic. And also, importantly, to promote the shared values that we have and the shared commitment towards, sort of reaching our greatest aspirations and being all that we say we want to be, who we say we want to be, as opposed to, sort of coming up short.
I really appreciate the work that Raven is doing, including this new initiative from the Raven Academy, the class that you're organizing for organizations that are committed to doing diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organizations. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I think our listeners may be really good candidates for the course.
No, that's great. So the idea is to really, as you said, to sort of bring diversity professionals together to provide both networking, but also to help them to navigate both the specifics of their situations, but also to, as things continue to unfold, sort of how do you go forward in this moment? And as a profession, we are seeing, in some places, whether it's, sort of getting rid of those units or putting them under something else, or, sort of losing access to the executive levels folks, et cetera. And what we want to do is make sure that we are empowering chief diversity officers and others who work in this space as much as possible, both to show up within their organization and also to lead, right? So how do you position yourself and make sure that you continue to have the ear of the CEOs and presidents, et cetera? How do you work with sort of the general counsels and whatnot in your organizations to make sure that you are mindful of, and of course, and respectful of whatever the law requires, but also that you are able to share your perspective on where there are legal requirements and where there are not. and then to make intentional choices with the organization about how you're going to show up. So it's not like, oh, I had no idea, right? It is like, no, I'm part of the role of your listeners. And I think of the role of my, the work that I do is to make sure people know, like, these are choices you are making. And so you may make them, and they could be based on any number of things, which is totally fair, but you are making them. And so, sort of supporting chief diversity officers and others as they think through how they show up in their organization and then how they lead in this space are two really important pieces. And Raven Academy, I will say, I think one of the great things about it is that you have the benefit of not only our team, but we know so many people in the space. So like sort of the opportunity to hear from others, and then the opportunity to network with, sort of folks who are, excuse me, who are, sort of working at some similar issues, who may, both have similar struggles, have similar opportunity, have tried things that you want to try, have learned some lessons that maybe you can, sort of short circuit. So, anyway, so I think it's a, sort of great space. We've done it, similar programs we have going with chiefs of staff, and I'm going to start one on Black women leaders of organizations. And so, just what we try and do is just based on what we're seeing and who we're meeting, where we see opportunity to both bring people together. So the role as a convener, and then share our experience and expertise, and then, sort of create new networks. And so those are all, I think, important pieces.
And it sounds like you're doing that on those topics that are in the pulse of our lives right now, the things that are most relevant. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Just knowing that you're out there gives me a sense of security, inspiration, happiness, knowing that there's organizations like you doing this great work. I was going through your website and I saw that one of your guiding principles is that you do hard work with humor. And I thought, where's the humor in this situation? Where's the levity? And I know that when you're fighting with the resistance, right? When you've got some fundamental work that you need to do, you have to find the laughter and the joy and the thing that replenishes you. So if you want to leave us with some parting thoughts, right? What is some of the humor and levity that you're seeing that could help us? Give us a little bit more inspiration to say goodbye with.
Well, the only humor and levity I found since January 20th is that I will not, and I don't think many will miss paper straws. And so, that is the one thing that, doing battle with a paper straw is really, it's a losing proposition. And so even with a nod to the environment, the paper straw bit, we will, I will say for myself that is the bit that I find like, okay, that's fine. Otherwise, there's not a lot of humor here. I think that there is the opportunity to, see some ironies in terms of like when you think of how extra overqualified people of color in particular need to be to like sort of get any job. And then the flip side is like, they're firing people of color and then they're hiring people who are less qualified. It's an interesting irony. I don't know if it's humorous per se, but I think that, we have to hold on to our sort of core beliefs while at the same time creating space to invite others to better understand what we're thinking and for us to better understand them. And so I think this moment creates a lot of opportunity for us to dig a little deeper, be a little more inclusive. Being, diversity, equity, and inclusion is not only about like what we think and what we want and how we look at the world. It is really being willing to open the conversation up. And so to the extent that we can do that, and have folks better understand how we approach this and better understand the hesitance or reticence that others have, I think that can be good for us, however painful it is. And so I just urge us all to take advantage of whatever bright spots we can find in this moment to do the very work we say we care about, which is to create environments that are more diverse and more inclusive and more equitable. And this is a test of that. And we just have to meet it.
Excellent. Chrissy, thank you so much for being with us for this episode. I think that our audience is really going to appreciate your candor, the depth of the insights from the research, as well as the way in which you've inspired some of our thinking. So thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it was a pleasure. I'm so glad to have been here. Thanks for including me.
Thanks. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.